Welcome to the Design Materials channel. I am Edson Mafus, architect and professor of architectural design at the School of Architecture, Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, Porto Alegre, Brazil. I'm back with another video on architectural design, this time to talk about a series of different conceptions about the nature and the constitution of architectural space. The title mentions the 20th century and the 21st century, but actually our story has to begin at the final years of the 19th century, which is when the first ideas about modern space were formed. There is no intention to exhaust the subject. Probably everyone who tries to deal with this topic will choose categories that do not match 100% those presented here. In any case, I hope this subjective list of examples will be useful to you. Although human beings actually created and used architectural space since they built the first shelters for themselves, it was only at the end of the 19th century, with the birth of aesthetics as a branch of philosophy, that the idea of space came to exist and be proclaimed as the essence of architecture. The fact that the first recognition of the conscious idea of space was formulated in 1893, simultaneously by the German philosophers Hildebrand and Schwarzkopf, makes many people think that it was born with modern architecture, which is incorrect, since only 3 or 4 decades later the concept was to become part of the modernist ideology. The categories that will be discussed after this have one thing in common: their relationship with modern architecture, even if it is by opposing it. I deliberately leave out certain recent developments, variously called deconstructivism, formless architecture, bubbles, folds, architecture catastrophic, liquid architecture, etc. The main reason for this is their lack of systematicity. What cannot be described in a few words cannot be transmitted either. Not being a discussion about the philosophical aspect of the concept of space, the discussion and analysis that follows is centered on specifically design aspects. The way in which each room is spatially defined, how it relates to the adjoining rooms, and how it relates to the exterior space. Let's begin with Palladio, and more precisely with pre-modern architecture, with traditional space, consisting of almost complete enclosures in which the walls play a fundamental role, concentrating all subsystems, volumetric definition, internal subdivision, supporting structure, permeability, etc. This is the way people built for centuries, until more or less the end of the 19th century. Here in the Palazzo Borghese, we'll see two important features of architecture in this specific period, which is a long period covering several centuries. One of them is that the thickness of the masonry walls was used to define the elementary shapes of each space. This thickness that we can see here, where is the mouse cursor, this thickness was called in the French Architectural Academy of Beaux-Arts poché, which is this black area. The name comes from the filling up of the drawing in plan with ink. But in practical terms, it means that the walls were made thick in order to better configure the adjoining rooms. We can see here that this piece is an almost triangular piece of masonry containing a stairwell, but the main purpose of it is to define very precisely the rectangular rooms to the right and to the left. So this is something that comes directly from Roman architecture, in which the same phenomena happens. The second important feature is that one way of transcending the closeness of any single space was the creation of what the French again called enfilades, a series of rooms in sequence, with the doors between them aligned so as to obtain a long perspective view. This was a way of becoming aware of the sequence of rooms, something which was very difficult if you stayed in one room whose door had no alignment with the room next door. So was a kind of recurrent practice in this kind of thing, the creation of enfilades. Another thing about the notion of poche, as it appears here in this project for an abbey in France at the end of 18th century, is that the poche was not always made out of masonry. Sometimes the poche, that is this element that helps to define the shapes of rooms, of normally the main rooms, was also made with cabinetry, like you see here on the left. It's an enlargement of this room here on the right, so you can see that the sleeping alcove, the bathroom, wardrobes, and so on are all defined with light material, with wood. And the main purpose, besides creating auxiliary spaces, was to define very, very precisely the shape of the main rooms. In this case, the sleeping room, here the living room, and again here uh, a room which ends up with a kind of round ending, connecting to both of the other rooms just mentioned. Another aspect of traditional architecture has to do with the introduction of circulation and service spaces. What we see here is the plan of the Versailles Palace. Although dissatisfaction with the lack of practicality in French palaces was already explicit for several decades, it is in the second half of the 18th century that one can see how service spaces acquire importance. Here is also the origin of the term apartment, which we still use today. More or less at the end of 18th century, the palaces where the nobility lived in France began to receive a series of service spaces which served to end that uh, annoying practice of having to traverse several spaces in order to get to space, from space A to space F, for instance, which was the usual in uh, in buildings like, for instance, the Palazzo Borghese, which was seen a couple of images behind. What we see here is that this portion of Versailles Palace, which was called the apartment because it was separated from the rest for the use of a family, we see here in the periphery the main rooms, and we see in yellow here the service areas which could be used without bothering people in these rooms, something which could not happen in the Borghese Palace. Let's just go back and see that to come from this room to that room, we had to go across all the other rooms, something which was not needed anymore in Versailles. Then we finally reached the beginning of the development of a modern idea of space. And this is what we could call the first open plan of modern architecture. It, it is the first step in the evolution of modern space. The undoubtedly the Wrightian open plan. Throughout the last decade of the 19th century and the first of the last century, Frank Lloyd Wright dedicated himself to the breaking of the box, in his own words, of traditional architecture. That is, to transcend a spatial relationship that consisted of a series of adjacent spaces whose relationship to each other and to outside was kept to a minimum. What Wright introduces results in a dramatic increase in permeability between contiguous spaces and effective integration with the surrounding open space. The means employed for this purpose are reduction of external and internal walls to the minimum possible from the structural point of view, interpenetration of the enclosures, diagonal movement, and decomposed global shape, without losing the clarity of the configuration of the spatial units. What we see here is the plan of the Darwin D. Martin house, and very especially this area here, where we see three rectangular spaces which are connected visually between them and to the external space, as we can see here. This is achieved by maintaining many smaller elements of conventional architecture, which may perhaps help to explain the success that his domestic architecture achieved in the first decades of the 20th century. What I mean by that is that beams are maintained, these above head elements are kept in order to still give a hint of the spatial units that were combined to achieve this fluid space that we see here in the picture. A very interesting aspect of this procedure is the fact that it applies to buildings of any size, be they large houses like this one, like the Martin House, one of the so-called prairie houses, and also to much smaller ones, such as the Usonian houses built by Wright 30 years later during the Depression. Here we see a house which is perhaps 1/10 of the size of the Martin house, having the same kind of spatial conception. We can see that the dining alcove has its own definition by some walls and by the lower ceiling, but it's connected to the main living room, and it doesn't lose its own identity as a specific space. Then we come to what we could call the neoplastic space, which is the next step in this development. Essentially, the neoplastic space is an anti-cubic architecture resulting from the articulation of planar elements that can assume varied and interchangeable roles such as walls, roofs, floors, etc. Its origins are Dutch neoplasticism, which was a kind of uh, movement that covered all kinds of art, and Wright's own architecture, a very strong influence in Europe, at least in Holland, at the beginning of the 20th century. The result of this combination is an abstract, essential architecture characterized by the centrifugal composition from a central core. Two of its most notable characteristics are the abolition of the duality between interior and exterior due to the rupture of conventional walls and the use of primary colors as an element to accentuate its planarity. Neoplastic architecture is essentially volumetric and anti-gravitational in the sense of revealing nothing of its real weight. the result of a formal construction whose fundamental compositional element is the rectilinear plane that can assume any identity. The most complete examples of neoplastic architecture were produced by Gerrit Rietveld, and after that very little was done based on this spatial conception. But its echoes can be found throughout the 20th century, as in projects by the Spanish José Antonio Coderc, the Portuguese Eduardo Souto de Moura, and Helio Piñón, another Spanish architect of the 20th century. The Schroeder House is the first real example of flexibility in the configuration of the domestic space, resulting in what could be called a transformable plan. Here we see in this plan on the right the two extreme possibilities. On the very right, we see the top floor subdivided in the traditional way into several discrete spaces, and on the left we see all these sliding doors uh, pushed back, and the space as one single space, as it's shown in the picture on the left. We can see also here where the sliding doors would slide in order to subdivide. It is a plan that allows for many configurations. The Sculpture Pavilion at the Kröller-Müller Museum is another work that corresponds to the description just made. Then we have what is called the Raumplan, almost parallel to neoplasticism, happening almost at the same time. The Raumplan, it's a way of creating an interior space with enormous potential. It was created by Adolf Loos, and Raumplan is a term that can be translated as space plan or spatial plan, as it refers to a three-dimensional or vertical ordering of space. One of the most salient features of this concept is the arrangement of cubic spaces of different proportions and heights within an elementary prismatic volume. These rooms have different floor and ceiling heights according to their character and hierarchy. As a consequence, the visualization between spaces is essentially on diagonal lines. The centrifugal character of these projects is evidenced by the presence of alcoves attached to the main spaces, and by the eccentric or asymmetrical way in which the circulation is resolved, resulting in a spiral movement through the body of the building. Here we see the main living room of the Müller house, and here we see what was mentioned as the diagonal views that can be obtained from one small space to the big one, or the other way around. And here on the left, the sections. We can see what was described on the lower section, not on the top one. Perhaps due to the difficulty of accommodating many spaces of different height within the same volume, we have seen very little use of the Loosian Raumplan in the following decades. Here we see a contemporary attempt at Raumplan, but we can only see it in section. The picture of the space does not reveal what the author is trying to do. Then we come to one of the most important developments, which is the Corbusian free plan, or plan libre. Le Corbusier's theoretical and design production is of decisive importance for 20th century architecture, especially in Latin America. Among its many contributions, the free plan stands out, a solution made possible by broader technical invention. By a broader technical invention, the domino scheme, which in essence is a structural system consisting of a homogeneous grid of columns and overlapping slabs, which allows independence between structure, subdivisions, and facades, and the release of ground and roof as new areas of use. Generally contained in compact volumes, or in a group of such volumes, the free plan is characterized by providing visual connections in depth both between interior spaces and towards the exterior. To this horizontal extension is added the possibility of vertical extensions due to the presence of double or triple height. The famous sketch seen here, the four compositions, reveals the conceptual duality around which all Le Corbusier's work revolved. On the one hand, the imperative need to solve functional requirements through empirical form, and, on the other hand, the impulse to use abstract forms that affect the senses and nourish the intellect. In other words, how to reconcile the private domain of modern convenience with the public facade of architectural order. Another important aspect of the Corbusian free plan is the idea that the plan orchestrates a path that connects the main spaces in a narrative way. It is the so-called architectural tour, also called in the normal architectural jargon promenade architecturale, another heritage of 19th century French architecture. Here we change architects and start to look at what I would call the Mission free plan number 1, or the Mission European free plan. Using as references Le Corbusier's independent structure, Dutch neoplasticism, and Wright's rapture with the collection of boxes as ingredients, Mies van der Rohe created his own version of the free plan. In projects like the German Pavilion in Barcelona, the Tugendhat House, and others, carried out in its European phase, there is an interior without divisions in which vertical planes articulate the space, creating areas of use, much more than creating rooms, and sometimes extending towards the outside. This kind of space, in which the independence of the supporting structure, internal division, and facade definition is clear, is contained between planes parallel to the ground and is characterized by its horizontal extension and irregular volume. The second is a project not built, in which this feature of extending some of the internal walls to the surrounding open area is very, very evident. So this was the European free plan. Here we see what we could call the American Mission free plan. In the American phase of Mies van der Rohe's career, a second version of the free plan appears, whose most notable aspects are compact volumes. The buildings of this phase are almost always rectangular-based prisms. Subordination of the plan's subdivisions to the position of the structural elements, symmetrical spatial organization, and almost total separation from the outside. What I'm trying to show is what someone like Carlos Martiariz have called the Diaphanous Pavilions, of which there are two variations. that have become almost canonical in modern architecture. On one hand, the rectangular volume with external monodirectional structure, in which the facades are coplanar with the pillars. This is the first one. We can see here at the crown hall the external structure running in one only direction with supports that get mixed up with the windows, with the glazing of the building. So it's quite difficult if you don't look very carefully to make out which elements are the columns, so to speak, and the mullions of the glazing. So this is Diaphanous Pavilion type 1. The second kind of diaphanous pavilion is in general a square volume in plan, and in the roof, covered by a bidirectional metallic roof slab supported on a minimum number of peripheral pillars, never placed on the corner, with the interior limit set back in relation to its projection. Here we see the square shape, we see very few columns, 8 in fact here, never on the corner, and the internal space is recessed in relation to the projection of the roof. Probably something Mies learned from working in very hot climates like Cuba and Mexico when he designed the Bacardi buildings for these places. So this is also a way of protecting the glass from the sun. And here we see the picture of what I was saying. Here we get to what can be called postmodern space. In the period from the late 1960s to the mid 1980s, modern architecture underwent a series of revisions, and something emerged that we could call, for lack of a more precise term, postmodern space. Two of its most noticeable features are the preferential use of walls and a resistance to use the free plan of modern architecture. Even thick walls like those of the past are used again, although they are no longer massive and have secondary functions within them. In this project, Venturi creates a kind of thick wall in which from the inside we have storage spaces, and from the outside we see that the windows are recessed in order to be protected by the overhang. Not to mention other things which appear here, like applied decoration, the emphasis on the entries, which are all taken from historical architecture and that have nothing to do with modern architecture, having been the cause of many negative critiques of Venturi's work along his career. Here is the famous house for Venturi's mother, in which he combines a whole series of influences from historical and even from modern architecture, and introduces plan variations that he takes from historical architecture, especially from the work of the English architect Edwin Lutyens. The history of architecture is thus rediscovered, quote unquote, by architects, and many of its elements and strategies are reinterpreted, as is the case, for instance, of the box inside the box idea, inspired by the Baldacchino of St. Peter's in other similar situations. Here we see one of Charles Moore's own houses in which he empties the interior of an existing house and populates it with these uh, empty towers that serves to create vertical space within the house. And more precisely, more akin to the description I've just made of the use of the baldacchino is his another of his houses, this time in the West Coast in California, where the living area and the bathroom area, the shower area, are defined by a small space within the larger space of the house by four columns and their own small roof, internal roof, which we can see here in the plan, and we can see also in the picture of the building. At this time, modern architecture itself becomes history, and therefore subject to reinterpretation, as in the case of layered composition, inspired by Stein and carried out by Michael Graves in several of his works of this time. What I mean by that is that architects like Graves in at this period discovered that Le Corbusier in the Villa Stein worked with this tight layered compositions in which you can see the main plane of the facade, but there is another plane just behind it and another one just in front of it. And Graves plays with it in these neo-Corbusian schemes of the 1970s and 1980s. At the end of the millennium, the impetus of revisionism that tried unsuccessfully to replace modern architecture had cooled, and we were faced with the resumption of many modern principles and with several extrapolations of the old domino scheme. The resumption of domino is, however, characterized by the overlapping of systems, the lack of hierarchy, sectional discontinuity, and the separation between interior and exterior. So we see works like Toyo Ito's Mediatek in Sendai, in which the familiar sequence of horizontal slabs appears, no longer supported by regular columns, but by a system of three-dimensional supports distributed irregularly, which contain space and serve for the circulation of various kinds of fluids and people, in a kind of updating the original free plan. Here we see more clearly both the essence of the building, which is a series of slabs supported by these uh, big and empty columns, so to speak, whose design is supposed to have to do with seismic protection. And on the right, we see the plan, which resembles the domino scheme, but is a very different thing from it. In the project for the Paris Library by OMA, the compact and prismatic volume and the homogeneous grid of pillars are present, but the slabs of the domino scheme have disappeared. The volumes that house the main activities seem to float like fish in an aquarium, as if they could change position if necessary. In other cases, it does not seem to be enough to transform the original domino scheme, and differences are introduced that defy common sense. I refer to treating the floor where people walk and where all types of activities are to be performed as a wavy interior topography. It seems that internationally renowned architects are allowed to counter something as elementary as the flatness of the floor in a building. Here we have a project which was not built, I would say fortunately, for a convention center in Morocco by OMA. And here's something that was built, the Rolex Learning Center, in which the same phenomenon happens. The ground floor is this thing which looks like a hill and which is quite difficult to use for any purpose than just for intervals. I don't see anyone working in this kind of space. It is worth mentioning, albeit in passing, that countless attempts to design objects that do not configure any spatial system and are unique, a kind of object with no past and future. An example of this, and one of the most radical, is the Dutch Pavilion built in Hanover in the International Fair in 2000, in which each floor is solved with total independence from those above and below in terms of structure, closure, and plan distribution. As if to prove that in architecture there is always a return to themes apparently left in the past, but that this return always adds something to what we try to update, there have been several recent examples of plan distributions that take up the theme of rooms in sequence, without the mediation of corridors or other transition spaces. There is no hierarchy between those spaces, which is not necessarily a problem, but it does require users to conform to a spatial scheme that they are not used to. This is a project by a very interesting firm from Barcelona, H Architects, in which we see 10 rooms which are basically the same in sequence, no corridors, no circulation area. What they do here is to place all the bedrooms in the top line and all the common rooms in the bottom line, which uh, allows people to circulate in this row of spaces and then reach the others from here, which in a way minimizes the functional problem that used to happen in the 18th century, 17th century. Here we see a picture which we can compare with that of the Palazzo Borghese in terms of the enfilade. From one point of view, we get a sense of the whole sequence of spaces. And to end with a more complex version of the same phenomenon, we see this house by Emilio Tugnon, in which we have not only sequences of rooms, but this is uh, done using the famous 9 square plan, which is the object of so many exercises especially in schools of architecture in North America. Here, the lines between the 9 modules are used to accommodate bathrooms, wardrobes, storage spaces, the kitchen, in a way that reminds one of some of the experimental houses designed by Lucan, like the Devore and Adler houses. And we have the same feature of having to circulate from one main room to another to reach the other rooms, which, to repeat what I said before, demands that the client be aware of this and be and to accept this. Well, thank you very much for watching. I hope you liked it and that you come back for more. And do not forget to subscribe to be informed of the next videos. Thank you very much and take care.